Welcome back to Wrong Sports, and I am going back to one of my favorite series on this channel called How the Year Was Won, where I cover a year in college football. I explain to you all the top teams and who won that year, and this is one of my top 3 favorite years in college football. It has everything from upsets to conference moves to new teams, and even a game of the century. The year of 1993 was also the first year I kind of started watching college football. I wouldn't be obsessed with it for another few more years. And if you watch my 1990 video that I did on how the year was won that year, you'll see how much I covered in that year. And this year will be another long one, so strap in. Hopefully it won't be 2 parts though, I'm hoping not. But before we get into that, make sure as always you subscribe to the channel below. If you aren't already, ring the bell as well so you get updates on brand new videos that I will be dropping in the future. Of course, you can help out the channel too on my Patreon. The link is in the description below. You can also check out my podcast down in the description as well. And please like this video and share this video with other college football fans so I can get more subscribers to this channel. Thank you very much. Coming into this 1993 season, Alabama were the defending national champions. They were bringing back their quarterback, Jay Barker, and their best offensive player in kick returner and running back, David Palmer. But after the national title season, half of their great defense from 1992 was drafted, so they would have a lot of new pieces on the field. But that really didn't seem hard for Alabama to get over since they had Gene Stallings coaching, and he had always done a good job with replenishing the team and also coaching defense. Due to some of the defensive losses, though, they would still start the season pretty high as they were ranked number 2. Strange for some, especially for Miami fans, were that Florida State was ranked number 1 in the preseason poll ahead of Alabama and ahead of Miami, even though Miami had beaten Florida State the last 2 years with some wide field goal tries conserving the victory. Florida State, of course, would have the legend Bobby Bowden, who had about 20 years in and almost 200 victories under his belt, but he still didn't have that elusive national championship to his name. This year, though, it was looking like he might get it, as he was bringing back one of his most electrifying players in quarterback Charlie Ward. And trust me, if you didn't watch college football this year, you would still know the name Charlie Ward, as he was one of the guards on Florida State's team that went to the Elite Eight in the NCAA tournament in 1993. Plus, he had made a name for himself a few years before that as a freshman when he hit a game-winning shot for Florida State in the conference tournament. But on the football field, he was showing his talents, as in 1992, he threw for over 2,600 yards and ran for 500, plus he scored 28 touchdowns. Along with Ward coming back, Florida State also was bringing back their awesome defense. And yes, this defense was spectacular the previous year. They would get even better this year. They were led by Derek Brooks and Derek Alexander, which gave up an average of 15 points per game. But now that they had a year under their belt, they were built up to be really good again this year. And their first game would be in the Kickoff Classic on August 28th. They would play Kansas, who couldn't do anything against this powerful FSU defense, and FSU would win easily 42-0, showing an early glimpse at just how good Florida State's defense and this team overall was going to be the rest of the season. But behind Alabama and Florida State was a team that doesn't get talked about a lot. That would be Texas A&M. A&M were led by R.C. Slocum, who had led the team to a 12-0 record in 1992, but only got up to the number 4 ranking in the poll. This might be because the Southwestern Conference was quite weak, as SMU was still destroyed from their death penalty a few years ago, plus Arkansas left the Southwestern Conference after 1991, and this conference had a lot of 6-5 and 7-4 teams over the last few years, further weakening it. A&M was still a really good team that had a fun offense, that were averaging over 400 yards per game. The reason for that was they had a great 1,000-yard runner in Greg Hillback, and their defense was also very good, as it was coached by a future Notre Dame head coach in Bob Davie, and they had a future NFL All-Pro in Aaron Glenn on it too. The defense would show their strength in their first game as they shut out LSU 24-0, and even though they had won their first game by shutout, they dropped a spot in the poll as they were ranked number 4 in the preseason poll, and then in the next poll on September 7th, they would drop to number 5. That might have been because the team that was ahead of them was Michigan. And Michigan were coming off of a very weird 1992 season where they had won the Big Ten and had an unbeaten season, but they finished 9-0-3. They would still have Coach Gary Moeller, as well as defensive coordinator and future head coach for Michigan, Lloyd Carr. They were both trying to win the Big Ten for the fourth consecutive season, too. But they were going to lose some great players from their previous year, as they lost All-American defensive tackle Chris Hutchinson and their quarterback Elvis Gerbach. But they would have some great underclassmen back, as they would have quarterback Todd Collins, offensive tackle John Runyon, and wide receiver Armani Toomer. And in that first game, Todd Collins would show just how good this offense would be, as he threw for 2 touchdowns in the first half, and their great running back Tyrone Wheatley would run for 118 yards and 1 touchdown, as they would beat Washington State 41-14. And you know what? I'm going to stick with Michigan, as they would have a huge game in their second weekend of September, as they played number 11 Notre Dame. Now, I haven't mentioned Notre Dame yet. That was because they were coming off a 10-1-1 season where they played and won the Cotton Bowl. Lou Holtz was still coaching the team, but they had lost their quarterback from the previous few years in Rick Meyer. They would be playing a completely different quarterback in Kevin McDougal. McDougal was a running quarterback, but he was good for a few things for their offense, and they had a great defense led by Ronaldo Wynn and Brian Young on their line, and they also had some really good cornerbacks like Bobby Taylor. In Notre Dame's first game versus Northwestern, the defense scored once, while their running offense got in twice to win the game 27-12. In Notre Dame's second game, they would travel to play previously mentioned Michigan, and it would be a game of 2 halves. The first half saw McDougal run for 2 touchdowns and get another interception return for a touchdown to have Notre Dame up 24-10 at half. But in the second half, Michigan made a late comeback, which wasn't enough, as Notre Dame would hold on to win 27-23. The win would push Michigan out of the top 5 that they had just gotten back into, and Notre Dame would solidify their top 5 position. I'm not going to move to the next week, because instead we're going to head to Norman, Oklahoma, as Texas A&M would face the Sooners. The Sooners were getting back to being what they were in the 1980s, as under Gary Gibbs, Oklahoma were able to become a winning team again, even though they were under very harsh probation in 1989 and 1990. Even though they wouldn't have a losing season, they still couldn't win their conference, the Big 8 Conference, which was won by Colorado and then was dominated by Nebraska after that. But in this game, it wouldn't matter, because they would be playing Texas A&M, who was out of their conference, and they would completely dominate in this game, being up 17-0 at half, and then scoring 24 points in the fourth quarter to win 44-14. The new top 5 for September 14th would have Florida State at number 1, who won their first 3 games now by an average of 40-plus points and had only given up 1 touchdown. Alabama was second, while Miami was third, who we haven't mentioned yet, but I'll get to in just a little bit. They were 1-0. They had just won their first game over a ranked Boston College team, who you will also hear about later on in this season. And due to Notre Dame's big win over Michigan, they would jump from number 11 to number 4, with Tennessee now rounding out the top 5. And speaking of Tennessee, they had their huge game in the annual 3rd Saturday in September versus Florida. And Tennessee this year were coached by Philip Fulmer, who stepped in to coach the team in 1992 after Johnny Majors had to step away for medical reasons. In 1992, Fulmer would lead Tennessee to a 4-0 record, and when Majors officially stepped away, Fulmer was signed in to be the full-time coach starting in 1993. And the Tennessee offense was full of well-known players like Heath Schuler at quarterback. They also had Charlie Gardner and James Stewart at running back. And their opponent was Florida, who under Steve Spurrier were hitting their stride at this point. Spurrier had come back to his alma mater in 1990 as the team were under probation, and he still managed to win 9 games in that first season. Then in his second year, he led Florida to win the SEC title for the first time ever. Yes, it is kind of strange, but up to 1991, Florida had not won the conference they called home for over 50 years. In 1992, they made it to the SEC title game where they lost. So coming into this year, many were looking at this to be the breakout year for Florida and to potentially win the national title. On top of that, another factor was that Florida's run-and-gun offense were putting up huge numbers, with their running back Eric Rett, and they also had receivers Chris Doring and Willie Jackson, which helped their freshman quarterback Danny Wuerffel put up big numbers. And speaking of Wuerffel, he got to play and was eventually the starter quickly this season due to Florida struggling in their second game versus Kentucky. After Florida's original starter Terry Dean threw 4 interceptions, Wuerffel would come in and lead Florida to a last-second touchdown pass to win. So now Warfel would be the starter, and he would face Schuler for Tennessee, and this would be quite the shootout of a game. It started slow with only 7 points in the first quarter, but after that, Warfel and Schuler threw for 8 total touchdowns and over 575 yards for 75 total points. And in the final quarter, with Tennessee down 38-20, they scored twice, but couldn't catch up to Florida, so Florida would win 41-34, and now they were in the driver's seat for the SEC title game, which would of course knock Tennessee out of the top 5, meaning the new top 5 would be number 1 Florida State, number 2 Alabama, number 3 Miami, number 4 Notre Dame, and now Florida would be the new number 5. And after Florida's big win, they were on a bye, as was number 1 Florida State, but you'll be hearing about them very soon. There was, however, one fun game to watch this week in Colorado versus Miami, which would happen in Boulder. Colorado lost the previous week to Stanford, but they were still considered a top 15 team. And the game was a crazy affair, as Miami had to hold off Colorado 35-29, and there would be some extracurricular action, as there would be a bench-clearing brawl late, which muddied up the fantastic game. So with most of the top 5 not playing, the top 5 remain the same going into the last week of September as we now move into October. And that first weekend of October didn't have any top 20 matchups either. This was kind of a boring 2 weeks here. And also all of the top 5 teams that would play in the first weekend of October would win and win in convincing fashion. Florida State would convincingly win as they destroyed Georgia Tech 51-0. They were now 5-0, winning games by 40 points or more, and only gave up 3 touchdowns through those 5 games. And I wanted to mention the Noles because they would welcome one of their biggest rivals into town as they had Miami come to Tallahassee the second Saturday in October. And the last 2 years these two teams played, it would end in brutal fashions for Florida State. Like I mentioned a little bit about this before, but in 1991 and 1992, those games are better known as Wide Right 1 and Wide Right 2. Due to Florida State missing 2 last-minute field goals that could have potentially at least won or tied those 2 games. This year's game, though, wasn't as close as the previous 2, as Florida State took a 21-7 lead at half and held off Miami to win convincingly 28-10. They scored a huge win, as well as show once again that Florida State's defense were amazing. That win would knock Miami out of the top 5, with now Ohio State taking over the number 5 spot and Florida State being number 1 with a commanding lead, as they had 61 out of 62 first-place votes. I'll go back to Florida State in a few weeks, but I'm going to keep it in the SEC for the next week or two because on October 16th, there would be a huge game happening down in Tuscaloosa between Bama and Tennessee. Tennessee were all over Bama in this game early, as they had a 17-10 lead going into the fourth quarter. But then Alabama, behind Jay Barker, went on an 83-yard drive to get Bama to tie it up at 17. The game would end in a tie, but it would save Bama's undefeated season for a little bit. But that nail-biter wasn't the only one in the SEC that week, as Florida went to play the undefeated Auburn Tigers. Auburn were under probation due to their previous coach, Pat Dye, and the new coach, Terry Bowden, not only had to get the team out of probation, but also had to get out of Dye's shadow, and also his own father's shadow. And he would prove that quickly, as Auburn was a very experienced team this year, so they would win their first 6 games pretty convincingly. The Florida vs. Auburn game would start with Florida taking a 27-14 lead at half, but after half, Auburn's rushing attack brought them back as they scored 3 touchdowns to take a late lead. Florida would fight to tie it up at 35 late, but Auburn had one more chance and kicked the field goal to win late and ruin Florida's season as the non-televised Auburn squad scored a huge upset. So now with that loss, Florida was out of the top 5, but Florida State would still be a unanimous number 1, with number 2 being Notre Dame, number 3 being Ohio State, who would move up quite a bit due to number 4 Alabama tying, and they would be another new number 5, as Nebraska, who just beat Kansas State that week, got themselves up into the top 5. And like I said, we're going to stay with the SEC this week again, as October 23rd would have some more SEC craziness, as Alabama would have a slugfest versus Ole Miss. Ole Miss were 4-2 at this point, but they had a top 5 defense, and that defense showed just how tough they were, as they knocked Alabama's quarterback, Jay Barker, out of the game. Due to that, Alabama had to play David Palmer at quarterback. He would mostly run, but he did complete a few passes for Bama so that they could manage to skate by Ole Miss 19-14 and still remain unbeaten. The top 5 did have some movement, with Nebraska falling back to number 6, and now Miami got themselves back into the top 5, as they were now number 4 because they shut out Syracuse. This also caused Alabama to now fall to number 5. And we are now at the end of October, and after a few weeks of one big game or another for the top 5, all 5 would face some good tests, with the exception of Florida State, because they proved once again they were a unanimous number 1 team as they destroyed Wake Forest 55-0. Notre Dame was at number 2, and they continued their fantastic season by going to Philly to play Navy, and Navy would give them a game, as Navy was up at half, but after half, Notre Dame would outscore Navy by 38 points to win 58-27. Number 3 Ohio State would have their toughest game so far that week, though, as they would play Penn State. And the Nittany Lions were 5-1 after a close loss the previous week to Michigan, but this team could score a bunch of points because they had some future top NFL picks. Like at quarterback, they had Kerry Collins, at running back, they had Kajana Carter, and they had Bobby Ingram at wide receiver. In this game, though, their offense could do nothing versus Ohio State's defense, as Kerry Collins would throw 4 interceptions, and they could only muster 2 field goals, as the Buckeyes convincingly beat them 24-6 to remain unbeaten. That top 5 would remain the same, but some big changes would finally happen in November. And we're going to stay with Ohio State as they kick off their first week in November versus a rising team in Wisconsin. Wisconsin were struggling over the last decade or more, as their last winning record was in 1984, and their last Big Ten title was all the way back in 1962. But under Barry Alvarez, they had managed to improve their record the last 3 years. And 1983 was his 4th year, and this was seen as a make-or-break year for Barry Alvarez. And he was going to make it count, as he had Wisconsin already at 7-1. They did just lose to Michigan the previous week, but Wisconsin needed to beat Ohio State, and they would have the Big Ten title in their grasp. The game looked like it would go Wisconsin's way, as Wisconsin led into the final quarter, until Joey Galloway got a late touchdown to allow Ohio State to tie it up. Wisconsin would have one final shot, though, and drive it for a late field goal, but the field goal was blocked, ending the game at a 14-14 tie. This ending would be significant for the end of the season and for the Big Ten title. You'll hear about that in just a little bit. And the tie was also significant for another team in Nebraska, who were always hanging around the top 5. As you remember, I mentioned them before, but they got knocked back out. This weekend, though, Nebraska would play Kansas, who took them down to the wire. Kansas did score late and were looking to end the game with a 2-point conversion. The conversion attempt didn't work, allowing Nebraska to win by 1, keeping them undefeated and moving them up from number 6 to number 4, 1 spot ahead of Ohio State. So you've heard me mention Florida State a lot, and for good reason, because this was the weekend. This was the biggest weekend of the regular season of 1993, because this was the game of the century. It was number 1 Florida State going to South Bend to play number 2 Notre Dame. This game was built up for weeks. College Game Day, which was still pretty new at the time on ESPN, they were visiting South Bend for this game. This was the first time they actually left the studio, so that was a big deal too. NBC would broadcast this game. They would have an epic pre-game video package that, if you haven't seen it, definitely go check it out. Just search it. You'll definitely find it. I also will play some of it in the background. Unless it's copywritten, then you won't see it. But to go along with all of that, the game was just a fantastic game. It was probably one of the best games of this season. And it would also show just how good Notre Dame was that year, as they outplayed and held Florida State's offense all game. Along with that, they burst through the Florida State defense, scoring 31 points on them, which was the most that Florida State had given up through the first month and a half of the season. But Notre Dame had a 31-17 lead in the 4th quarter until Florida State would start to make their comeback. They would score on an insane 4th and 20 touchdown pass to cut it to 31-24. And when I say insane, think of that insane 4th and goal pass that Alabama did in 2023 versus Auburn. And yeah, it was almost as crazy as that. Then, after Florida State stopped Notre Dame, they would have one final shot to tie it up and drove into scoring range late. But on the final play, Charlie Ward's pass into the end zone was knocked away, giving Notre Dame their huge 31-24 win. The win would move Notre Dame to be the unanimous number 1 team, while Florida State would only drop to number 2 after that loss. This might seem like a nothing burger, but whoa, did it mean something in 2023 when Florida State fans were pissed and are still pretty pissed about getting shut out of the college football playoff. But here they are in 1993, basically being set up for a national title, even though they lost. But anyway, I'll do a rant on that later. Behind them was Miami at number 3, who obviously couldn't jump Florida State since they lost to them. But more interesting was who was behind Miami at number 4, which was the still unbeaten and now Big 8 champion Nebraska, who would be going to the Orange Bowl to meet one of these other top teams. Again, more on that in a little bit. So now with Notre Dame's big win, they were the talk of college football and the sports world. They were 10-0 and every bowl game was looking to grab them for a big-time bowl matchup. The only thing was Notre Dame still had a game left before the bowl season. It would be against the 7-2, number 17 ranked Boston College squad. This was the first year of a full Big East football schedule, and Boston College struggled to start, as they lost their first game versus Miami, and then another one to Northwestern. But after that, they rolled off 7 straight wins, including 6 in the Big East, and they were in the Big East title hunt, as they would play a top team in the conference next in West Virginia. You'll be hearing about them in a little bit. But even though it wasn't a conference game, it was a rivalry game called the Holy War, and BC was ready to play. That might have been because they had some pretty big NFL talent on their team. One being a future Super Bowl head coach in Tom Coughlin. Yeah, Tom Coughlin was the coach at Boston College. A lot of people forget about that. They also had a top pick in next year's draft, as they had linebacker Mike Mamula, and they had Glenn Foley at quarterback. BC were in charge of this game pretty much the whole way. They had a lead throughout the whole game and were up 38-17 in the fourth quarter. That would be until Notre Dame would come back with 3 touchdowns, with one of them having a 2-point conversion, giving Notre Dame a 39-38 lead late. But BC would have one more chance. Behind Glenn Foley at quarterback, they would go down the field, and in one of my favorite game-winning plays, BC would kick a 41-yard field goal to stun and win this game 41-39, and upsetting the number 1 team in the nation. So now 2 weeks in a row, the number 1 team was upset. But that wasn't the only upset that day, and I'll get to the polling in just a little bit, because this next game would mean a lot to the rankings. And it would happen down in Morgantown, West Virginia. This is a team that I haven't mentioned yet, that being the University of West Virginia and the Mountaineers football team. They were undefeated at this point, and they weren't getting a lot of attention. That might have been because Miami were in the Big East and everyone cared about them no matter Miami's record. But really, West Virginia were coming out of left field, as they were 11-1 and they were in a national title game in 1988. But soon after that, they were non-factors, and their record the last 4 years was 23-19-3, and they went to no bowl games. Another thing was, this team was more team-oriented, or really group-oriented, as they didn't have one big star player at star positions. They were playing 2 quarterbacks a game, sometimes even 3, and they were also playing 3 running backs. So yeah, like I said, they didn't really have one guy everybody was focusing on. In addition, their out-of-conference schedule wasn't the best, as their best opponent was number 17 Louisville, and that didn't help because they just barely got by them, only winning by 2 at home. And also, Louisville would finish 9-3, and they lost their 2 other games to Tennessee and Texas A&M by 3 touchdowns or more. So West Virginia wasn't getting the voters' attention, and they wouldn't be ranked until October started, after that Louisville win. But after rattling off 5 more wins, they would get into the top 10 just before this game would happen. They were sitting at number 9, and West Virginia just had to win versus Miami and then beat BC the next week, and they would be the Big East champions. West Virginia would first play Miami at home in front of a record Mountaineer Field crowd of 70,222, The game was a close one too the whole way, but eventually West Virginia would pull it out after their running back Robert Walker took a touchdown run in to put him up 17-14. So now with the West Virginia win, they were propelled into the top 5, but they couldn't pass Notre Dame. Notre Dame would still be ranked in the top 5 at number 4, even though they lost. Auburn, still undefeated, were ranked at number 3. Nebraska, still undefeated, they were at number 2. And Florida State, with that one loss, was taking back their top spot. And if you're wondering who West Virginia jumped, well, it was Ohio State. And Ohio State under Ron Cooper had some trouble against that pesky team from up north, and it would hit them once again. Ohio State were unbeaten at this point. They were still 9-0-1, and if they won, they would win the Big Ten title, since Wisconsin, who they tied earlier, had a loss already to Michigan. Instead, Ohio State would have a terrible game as Buckeyes quarterbacks would throw interceptions on 4 straight possessions, and they would fail to reach the Wolverine 20-yard line at any point in the game. The final was a drumming as Michigan won 28-0, giving the Big Ten title to Wisconsin on a tiebreaker and sending Wisconsin to the Rose Bowl. So now we are at Thanksgiving weekend, and I'm going to go back to West Virginia, who had one final game versus Boston College, and if they won, they were going to be the Big East champion. BC was coming off that huge upset the previous week, and it looked like they were going to do it again, as they had a commanding 14-3 lead with only 11 minutes left. West Virginia would manage to keep their Cinderella season going as they scored 2 touchdowns in the final 10 minutes to come from behind and win 17-14. The win would give West Virginia an 11-0 record and the Big East title for the first time. I'm going to head to Lincoln, Nebraska, where the Cornhuskers would play the Sooners in their yearly Thanksgiving weekend matchup. It was usually for the Big 8 title, but Nebraska had sewn that up the previous weekend. And I know that Nebraska's undefeated and they're a national title contending team, but I haven't talked about them much, and it was because they didn't get into the national title picture until about 2 weeks before this game. I mentioned them a couple of times coming in and out of the top 5, and that was because the schedule Nebraska had wasn't the best, and in the games that they did have that were big games and important games, they didn't blow out teams. Example being in their 3rd game of the season versus UCLA, they had to travel to the Rose Bowl, and they just barely squeaked by 14-13. UCLA would be the Pac-10 representative in the Rose Bowl too, so I consider that a big game. Then Nebraska would play Colorado on the road on Halloween weekend, and due to a 21-point first quarter, they held on to beat the Buffaloes 21-17. So right there, again, not really the best looking win. If they would have blown out Colorado, it would have looked a whole lot better, like what Florida State has been doing all season. And the rankings reflected their mediocre schedule, as Nebraska moved up and down the AP rankings 10 weeks out of 15 weeks. And a reminder, they were undefeated throughout this entire season, so that's why I'm bringing up the schedule as an issue here. This team was fantastic. It was the start of the Nebraska dynasty for the next couple of years, and they were led by a lot of underclassmen like sophomore quarterbacks Tommy Frazier and Brooke Behringer, and on defense they had a freshman Mike Minter as well. They also have Trev Alberts, who was pretty much leading the defense at this point. He was a senior. Also, one more fun fact about Nebraska, this season the NCAA would outlaw the fumble-rooski play that Tom Osborne had used on a few occasions. And maybe they could have used that play in this matchup versus Oklahoma, as the Sooners would score first, but Nebraska would tie it up before half. After half, it was looking like this game might be a tie, which would really ruin Nebraska's season and completely take them out of the national title picture. But instead, in the 4th quarter, the offense, led by Tommy Frazier, turned it on and scored twice to win this game and end their season undefeated, which was the first time they had an undefeated regular season since 1983. So that game was on the day after Thanksgiving, while there was a battle between the Gators and the Noles happening the next day. Both of these teams were coming in with one loss, like I mentioned before. Both of these teams were in the top 5 too. I've mentioned them plenty of times. And most people were still focusing on Florida State, who won the previous week 62-3 over NC State. So I guess they made up a little bit for losing to Notre Dame. Meanwhile, Florida was on a tear after their loss to Auburn a few weeks ago. Florida was scoring over 40 points per game after their loss, and they were in the SEC title game that would be happening the next week. So beating the Seminoles could really put Florida in the driver's seat for the national title. The game would start slow though, with only Florida State scoring just as the first quarter ended. They would have a slim lead at half and finally take a big lead in the third quarter with 2 Charlie Ward touchdown passes to be up 27-7. In the final quarter, Florida and Steve Spurrier would fight back with 2 touchdowns of their own to be down only 6 late in the game. But just 30 seconds after they got within 6 points, Charlie Ward would escape a sack and get a pass down to Warwick Dunn, who would run the rest of the way for Florida State to take a 2-touchdown lead. And that would be the final, 33-21. And this game really solidified Charlie Ward's Heisman Trophy that he would win the next week by one of the largest margins ever, as he had almost 4-1 in total votes, and he had over 90% of the first place votes too. But before we get to the last regular season poll and all the bowl matchups, I have to get into the SEC championship game. This was the second year of the SEC title, and it would have quite a bit of controversy before it. I say that because, like I mentioned, Auburn was undefeated. They were ranked in the top 5 for most of the final month. They just beat Alabama the previous week, but since the team was on probation and not allowed to go to the championship game or bowl games, the conference had to go with Alabama versus Florida. Both teams had 2 losses already. Both teams also lost to Auburn, so this game really didn't have the gravitas and the national championship implications like the previous year's game did. In this year's game, Florida would exact their revenge on Alabama for last year's game by scoring a touchdown in every single quarter to win 28-13 and earn their bid to the Sugar Bowl. So now with the regular season officially over, the AP poll would look like this. Florida State was a commanding number 1, Nebraska right behind them, West Virginia couldn't get any further up than number 3, Notre Dame still hanging around at number 4, and Auburn being number 5. The coaches poll was a little different though, as they chose Nebraska for number 1, and they put West Virginia number 2, with Florida State going all the way down to number 3, and Notre Dame going all the way down to number 5. This meant it was quite a mess to find a national champion. And since this was before the BCS and the college football playoff, we were stuck with the new Bowl Coalition. If you don't remember what this is, then you're in luck, because it was a flawed system that college football had for 3 years. It grouped together the SEC, the Big 8, the Southwest Conference, the ACC, and the Big East, along with Notre Dame, with 7 bowl games, like the Orange Bowl, the Sugar, the Cotton, Gator, Sun, there was a few more, and it was there to find the best bowl matchups and to hopefully find a true national champion. But the flaw with this was that the Big Ten and the Pac-10 were not a part of the Bowl Coalition, and neither was the Rose Bowl, which usually messed up a lot of plans because one of the top teams was from one of those 2 conferences. Fortunately, though, this year, the Rose Bowl didn't have any top 5 teams or national title contenders. So this year, the Bowl Coalition could have a shot at actually putting together a bowl matchup to find the national champion. The first team the Bowl Coalition zoomed in on was Nebraska, who was undefeated, ranked number 2 in the AP and number 1 in the coaches poll, and they would be on their way to the Orange Bowl since they were the Big 8 champions. But finding their opponent had a little controversy. That was because Florida State was ranked number 1 but had a loss, as well as also being ranked number 3 in the coaches poll. While in the AP poll, the number 3 team, West Virginia, was undefeated. So instead of the Bowl Coalition sending the undefeated West Virginia team to the Orange Bowl so that we could have 2 undefeated teams play for the national title, they instead went with Florida State versus Nebraska. The reasoning was that since Florida State was ranked number 1 and they had beaten common opponents of West Virginia, like Miami, by a bigger margin, that they should be in. They were probably right, too. This was going to send West Virginia to the Cotton Bowl to play Texas A&M, the Southwest Conference champion, but instead the Big East Conference talked West Virginia administration into taking the more lucrative Sugar Bowl game to play SEC champion Florida, so they did that instead. This then pushed the coalition to have a rematch of the previous year's Cotton Bowl between Notre Dame and Texas A&M. The 1993 bowl games were shaping up to be great and hopefully find that true national champion. I'm going to run through some of the top other bowl games before I get to the Orange Bowl. First up was the Sugar Bowl, which had West Virginia trying to show they were a top team as they played Florida, but unfortunately that didn't happen, as Florida would throw all over them and won easily 41-7. In the Cotton Bowl, Notre Dame and Texas A&M were tied most of the way until a late field goal gave Notre Dame the win to end their season 12-1. The Rose Bowl would see Wisconsin take a 14-3 lead at half, But after half, USC would score 2 fourth-quarter touchdowns to make it close, but still lost to Wisconsin, giving Wisconsin their first Rose Bowl win in their first appearance in the last 30 years. But everyone was awaiting the national title game, which would be the nightcap on New Year's Day. Even though leading up to the game, Nebraska was given no shot. They were 17.5-point underdogs. And again, this was the team that was undefeated this season, so it shows just how good everyone thought Florida State was. And yeah, Florida State was good. They were destroying teams by 2 touchdowns a game, plus they had the newly minted Heisman winner. Ward would need to bring out all of the tricks in the Orange Bowl, as neither team could score until the second quarter when Florida State put up 2 field goals. Nebraska, though, would answer, with Tommy Frazier and a touchdown pass. But after half, Florida State would take the lead with a touchdown and a field goal, but due to going for 2 and not getting it, Nebraska were still 1 possession away. In the fourth quarter, Tom Osborne would pull out one of his tricks that he had, and he got a touchdown and a field goal, but due to Nebraska missing their 2-point conversion on the touchdown, they were only up by 1, 16-15, with just 1 minute to go. Florida State had not been in this situation since the Notre Dame game, as Charlie Ward led Florida State on a 62-yard drive to get them down to the 3-yard line, and Florida State converted the field goal to take the 18-16 lead late. But there was still some time left, enough time for Nebraska to manage to get to the FSU 29-yard line with 1 second left and attempt a game-winning field goal. Unfortunately for Nebraska and for longtime head coach Tom Osborne, the kick was no good, taking another potential national title away from Tom Osborne, who was still looking for his first as a head coach. Instead, it would give Florida State and their longtime head coach Bobby Bowden his first national title, and this win would also continue a long-running streak that isn't talked about much, but this was the 12th straight bowl win for Bobby Bowden as well. In the final poll, it would have Florida State at number 1 with 46 first-place votes, with Notre Dame at second with only 12. The coaches poll would have the same, but it would be a little bit closer, as Florida State had 36 first-place votes to Notre Dame at 25. You can see the final poll here, and you can see West Virginia did finish at number 6, which was their second highest ranking since that really good 1988 season, where they finished at number 5. But who do you think should have won the national championship in 1993? Do you think we should have gotten a rematch between Florida State and Notre Dame? I know that could have happened again. You could have put those 2 teams together. We could have gotten a rematch. I'm not sure what bowl game they could have done the Florida State-Notre Dame rematch in, because most of the other bowl games had conference tie-ins, or at least conferences that they would pick all the time. But maybe you could have put Notre Dame against Nebraska and given Notre Dame a shot at the national title, and then you could have put Florida State against West Virginia. That could have been another good game. There was a few options they could have done. The option they went with Florida State versus Nebraska was obviously the better option money-wise, because it was one of the highest rated games that year as well. But tell me what you think in the comments below. Tell me who you think should have been the national champion. Also, if you aren't already, please subscribe to the channel below, ring the bell, and help out the channel on my Patreon. All the links are in the description below.